Hello, everyone, again. Thank you so much for joining us for our 10-minute Bible lesson. We've been looking last week in the book of Jeremiah, and we're going to look at some passages again in the book of Jeremiah. When I was thinking about Jeremiah, I was thinking about his unenvying calling. Now, think about the calling that God called him to. God called him to tell his home country that they would be destroyed. I mean, that's what God called him to do. And I thought, wow, that's really a tough job to do. I think we can understand, that he was known as the weeping prophet, and I think that we could probably understand why. Well, why don't we just take a look at some verses in chapter 2, and we're going to begin in verse 9, and we're going to see what God has to say about Jeremiah's country. That would be Judea, and the main city would be the city of Jerusalem. We know that Jeremiah prophesied its destruction, and it was destroyed. It was destroyed by the Babylonians under their King Nebuchadnezzar in 586 BC. But let's kind of look at some of the background of it and kind of before all that happened. So let me read Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 9 and see what it says. So this is, therefore, I will bring charges against you. Now, remember, God is speaking through the prophet to his nation. So he says, I'm going to bring charges against you, says the Lord, and against your children's children, I will bring charges. Whoa. Now think about that. That couldn't be a happy time. It's never a happy time when God brings charges against us. Could I just say to you today that we have charges against us? All of us have charges against us in a personal way because we've all sinned. But it makes me really happy and rejoice that God has provided a way to have those charges dismissed. Now that's a relief, isn't it? And you know how he did that. He did that through Jesus. So, it's a tough thing. But I wanted to say this before God passes the sentence upon his people. He tells them the reason. He gives them a reason for it. And I think that's good, that he explains why it's going to happen. And I think sometimes God gets a bad rap from people because simply they don't understand. I don't understand everything about God, but I understand that God is holy. I understand that he kind of has the responsibility for the whole universe. In other words, he's the judge of the whole universe. And so, you couldn't have a just judge and just allow everything to go on and say, that's okay. You can do that. You can do that. That judge wouldn't be just to do that. So I want us to understand that God is going to give a reason why he's going to be destroying his people and leading them into captivity. And to understand that God doesn't do things arbitrarily. He doesn't do it out of whim. And God is always just and he's always fair. So I wanted to mention that. Well, let's go ahead and read a little more. Let's read in Jeremiah chapter 2, verses 10 and 11. Let's see what it said. See, he says this. He says, for pass beyond the coast of Cyprus and see. Send to Kedar and consider diligently. And see if there has been such a thing. Has a nation changed its gods, which are not gods, but my people have changed their glory from what does not profit. In other words, the glory of the nation of Israel, or Judea and Jerusalem, was God. That was their glory. And God says this, he says they have changed their glory for that which doesn't profit. Now you have to ask this question. Let me just pose this question to you. Why would God, who is the ruler of the universe, he causes it to rain, he brings the crops forth, he gives us the air that we breathe, the water that we drink. In fact, he even causes our heart to beat. Everything that we have comes from him. Now, let me ask this question. So why would God continue to bless and protect those that turn their back on him. I mean, does that sound reasonable to you? I think God is a reasonable God. And I noticed in this passage here, it's talking about countries, of course. So I wanted to mention this. I think this is important. Of all countries that have been, there are at least two countries above all others that should not have changed their gods. Now, what two countries do you think those are? Well, number one, it would be Israel. And I would have to say above all other countries. Maybe that have been blessed above all other countries, and the other one would be our country, the country we call the United States. So Israel and Judea, they had that happen. They forsook God around in the 6th century BC. So when did the United States do that? I would say that happened within the last half century. It's been relatively soon since the United States have forsaken their God. So God says to Judah, this is what he says. He says, look at Cyprus and Kedar. He says, pass through their coast and consider diligently. And here's the question. Has a nation changed its gods? That was the question. He says, go look at these countries, go through their coast, and just see if they've changed their gods. Now, God says they really weren't gods, right? So if a nation is worshiping gods that are not really gods, then they should change their God, right? But these nations, listen to this, these nations, even though they were worshiping gods that were not gods, were more faithful to their false gods than Israel was to the true God. And I think that's his complaint that he has against that. To me, that's an amazing thing. Well, let's look at the last two verses, and that's chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, and see what else the Lord has to say. So he says, be astonished, O heavens, at this, and be horribly afraid. Be very desolate, says the Lord. Now listen, he says, for my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, this is what God says, the fountain of living waters, and have hewn themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. Now maybe you know what a cistern is. I think I know what one is. I would say in ancient times it was like a hole in the ground, a giant hole in the ground that was the shape of a cylinder, and it was probably lined with rocks or bricks, and it was used to catch rainwater. And you know, people do that today. You can see videos and stuff of people who live in off-grid, and they can't afford the expense of digging a well. So what they do is they buy these cisterns. Now these cisterns are made out of polyester or some kind of plastic, but they have a system where when it rains, it gathers the water into these cisterns. And so that's kind of what a cistern is. But God says to them that they committed two evils. And the first evil that they had committed was that they forsook God. Now that's a really big mistake when you forsake God. And I say this could also be said about our country. I hope you would agree. I think our country is kind of, we don't learn from history. Now, we're studying history in a way here and see how God did with the children of Israel when they forsook him. But hey, we're living in real time now, and God's still in charge of the world. He still raises up some countries and brings other countries down. So it could be the United States. So he says, because of this, one should be astonished and horribly afraid because it's such a grave error. And the reason people should be so upset and bad about it is because of the consequences. I mean, it's just going to be something that's going to cause harm and make things a lot worse. Now, what was the second evil? Well, here's the second evil. He said they had hewn out their own cisterns, which were leaking. That is to say, they were broken and they wouldn't hold water. So two evils. One, they had forsaken him. Two, they had somehow made their own cisterns, but their own cisterns wouldn't hold water. In fact, we could just say that whether it's Israel or whether it's the United States, when a country forsakes God and trusts in its own strength and its own wisdom, hey, listen, there's only one thing that can happen, and it's not good. And so it's going to be a big disappointment. Now, notice God said what they had forsaken in this verse. Listen to this. He says, they had forsaken the fountain of living water. So when we forsake God, we forsake the very fountain of living water. And instead of having the living water, they made these cisterns where they were capturing water, and these cisterns were broken and they were leaking and they wouldn't even hold water. Now, here's the choice. Which would you rather have? Would you rather have something that just caught the rainwater, or would you rather have a living spring of water that just bubbled up? That's what God's saying. He said they've forsaken the fountain of living waters and they've turned to that which would not hold water. Well, we can see now, I think, a little better why God, when I say he destroyed that country, I just mean that he had another army come in and invaded it, and they burnt the city and they led the people away in captivity. Of course, a lot of people were killed in the war. But countries that forsake God, they're going to be broken. And I don't care if it was 1,000 years ago or if it's in this century. I know on our coins and our currency, we say in God we trust, but do we really? I think that we don't. And so I think that the message is really, really timely because it applies to us too. Now, Jeremiah, as I said, had a really unenvying calling, and that is he had to preach something that no one wanted to hear, but it was true, that God was going to forsake them and let them just go to their own ways. Well, I hope that we could learn something from the Bible. I hope that we could, and I hope that our country could. I would love to see our country a great turning back to the Lord and humbling ourselves, and quit thinking that we're so smart and so mighty. All we're going to do is mess ourselves up. But anyway, it's a little bit of a negative message. But listen, there are things in the Bible that are positive. There's things in the Bible that are negative, and we can learn from both of them. Hey, we appreciate so much you joining us. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you'll tune in again next time, and I hope you have a really good week.